to the 10-minute delay. No one, whether a member of a legal team, an accredited journalist, or members of the inquiry staff or contractors will be permitted to bring an electronic device into the hearing room. This includes mobile phones, smartwatches, even if switched off, AirPods and vapes. So I would ask you now to be very careful about checking your pockets and your bags for the existence of any such device. And if you have it, please leave it outside the hearing room. Thank you very much.
Yes, Ms. Whitelaw.
Morning, sir. We have Mr. Keith Asman this morning. Could the witness be sworn, please?
Please.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Asman, would you like to sit down? It's easier for you, and that's where the microphones are.
Thank you, sir.
Speak up, because the microphones are mainly for recording, and the questions will come from over there.
Thank you, sir.
Could you give us your full name, please?
Yes, my name is Keith Richard Vincent Asman.
Thank you. Sir, you made an order dated the 7th of November 2024 that's been published on the inquiry's website that this witness will be screened from the public and media while giving evidence. Mr. Asman, you know my name is Francesca Whitelaw and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Thank you very much for attending to give evidence today. You should have in front of you hard copies of 2 witness statements made for this inquiry. The first dated the 23rd of October 2024, running to 56 pages, and the reference is INQ 006140. Do you have a copy of that?
I do, sir. Yes.
Thank you. And you made a second statement dated the 12th of November 2024 of 2 pages. The reference is INQ 006188. Do you have a copy of that in front of you?
I have a copy of the statement, but without the INQ number.
Have you had an opportunity to read through both of those statements?
I have, sir, yes.
Can you confirm the contents are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are, sir.
Mr. Asman, they'll probably pop up from time to time, or bits of them on the screen, but have you got hard copies?
I have, sir, yes.
In case you need them. Remember, what I'm interested in is the evidence that you can give today, but of course you can refer or refresh your memory from the statements if that helps. You're not bound by them.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
So I would ask that both of those witness statements, together with the 2 exhibits, each witness statement refers to an exhibit. The first is INQ 006141, the second INQ 006119, that those be adduced into evidence in the normal way.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Mr. Asman, could you start by telling us what your role was in March and June 2018?
Yes, I was working for Counter-Terrorism Policing South East, part of the counter-terrorism network, and my role was Head of Forensics and Digital Investigations and Media Viewing.
And is that a role you had held since 2009?
It is a role I've had since 2009 in my current position. There is a however. So initially I was a police officer and I held that role from 1998 until I retired in 2009 as an officer, and then took up a similar role in Counter-Terrorism Policing South East.
So until retirement, were you also the co-chair of the National Counter-Terrorism Forensics Working Group since 2012?
I was indeed, sir, yes.
And also the UK Counter-Terrorism Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Forensic Lead?
I was, sir, yes.
And you retired, you say, in 2009?
I did, sir, yes.
And what rank of police officer had you achieved by then?
I was the acting detective inspector working on the forensic management team.
You refer in your statement to a number of significant cases in which you were involved when working in counter-terrorism forensic roles. Could you just tell us which cases those were, please?
Yes, I'll certainly give a précis. So I was the forensic coordinator for the London subway bombings on the 7th of July. I was the forensic coordinator for the UK side of the World Trade Centre bombings on 9/11. I was running the office during the liquid explosives inquiry, which prevented us taking liquids onto aircraft during that time. During that time, I also attended a number of bomb scenes and other significant events, as well as running the office during the time that Alexander Litvinenko was murdered.
And we don't need to go into the details, but you also mention in your statement being involved in the Tiger nightclub bombing response.
Yes, I was, sir. I was running the office during that time and the forensic response.
And the Glasgow airport attack.
Yes, that was linked to it, sir.
And Sussex Police's forensic response to the death of Alexander Pereplicny.
That is correct, sir.
And the forensic response to the death of Boris Berezovsky.
Berezovsky. Yes, sir, I was.
And I think you also gave evidence in the USA against Osama bin Laden and Abu Hamza, is that correct?
Yes, 2 independent cases. I gave evidence against against Abu Hamza in the United Kingdom, and then following his extradition, I went to the United States and gave evidence in the trial in the United States, and then independent of that, I gave evidence in the trial of Osama bin Laden in his absence.
And in terms of training, did you initially complete your CBRN training in 1996?
I did, sir, yes.
And subsequently your counter-terrorism CBRN training?
Yes, I did, shortly afterwards.
And did you initially pass your CT forensics course in 1998?
I did, sir.
And have you completed various refresher and update courses since qualifying in those fields?
I have, sir, both in the UK and overseas.
If we could have up on screen, please, your witness statement INQ 006140, page 1, paragraph 4. And you say there, Operation Verbasco on behalf of CT Policing has engaged fully with the inquiry and has made all potentially relevant material available to the chair and his legal team. The extent to which relevant material requires to be protected by way of restriction order has been the subject of detailed consideration and rulings by the chair. Those rulings are reflected in this open statement, and while I've sought to address as much as necessary, some matters which I consider it important to address can therefore only be included in the closed version of this statement. So do we understand, therefore, that you've drawn on contemporaneous documents of yours and others, such as notebooks, forensic team records and emails, when preparing your statement?
I have indeed, sir, yes.
And is some of the evidence open gists of closed documents?
That is true, sir, yes.
And as we've heard before with other witnesses, is that the purpose of that, to put into the public domain as much information as possible without endangering national security?
That's absolutely the case, sir, yes.
And as with others, there may be instances where you're not able to answer a particular question in open, or may need time to make inquiries to see what information you're able to give.
Yes, sir.
Before asking you about your own role, I should say, is it correct that you were previously referred to as VN513?
That is correct, sir, yes.
So if we see references to 513 in the VN513 in the documents, that will be you.
It will indeed, sir.
You've said that you were head of the forensic management team for Counterterrorism Police South East in 2018. As such, were you the leader of 3 teams?
I was indeed, sir, yes.
And tell us what those were.
Yes, sir, I had 3 teams operating for me. I had the forensic management team, I had the digital investigations team, and the media viewing team. And I can expand on their roles if you wish.
Well, if I could just bring up on the screen, just to assist you, your witness statement, INQ 006140, page 3, paragraph 14. Does that give an overview of the 3 teams' business before we come to the specifics of each?
It does indeed, sir. I just wanted to highlight the preparation and the professionalism of the teams that work within counterterrorism.
Well, we've heard how unprecedented the March 2018 events were, and without revealing any sensitive information, to what extent was the forensic team trained and prepared to deal with such an incident, firstly prior to March 2018?
They were very well prepared to deal with an incident of this nature. I personally, in the role that I had as the lead for counterterrorism, CBRN forensics, had ensured there was a capability to respond.
And having experienced the March 2018 events, were you better prepared in June 2018, or was it too soon for learning to have been identified and practices amended accordingly?
So without doubt, we were in a better place. There were lessons learnt from the initial incident before we arrived at the later incident. And one example may be that by the time I tasked the units, the action plan had been developed, the risk assessments had been done. It was very late in the day before the teams were doing the entries during the first incident. By the time of the second incident, we were tasking them the night before, the plan was developed, and they were going through the door the following morning. So that's just one example of the way in which we learnt.
Thank you, and I think we'll come to the specifics of the timings for each investigation. For now, could you tell us, and I'm at page 3, paragraph 15, just if you need to refer to it, first of all, the composition of the forensic team?
Excuse me, if I may refer to it, because I had given it some consideration. Yes, so the forensic management team in general is made up of a forensic manager who again had been in post for many years and was a retired detective. Working to him was a detective sergeant and a senior crime scene investigator, and then working to them were a number of crime scene investigators and detective forensic responders.
And it may be obvious for the name, but for what is the forensic team responsible?
So the forensic management team are responsible for responding to proactive investigations. So that is where intelligence is received to say that something may happen. So they'll be responsible responding to that for doing searches of addresses, arrests, etc., or post-event in relation to searches of properties, bomb scene examination, CBRN events, pretty much whatever there may be, we are responsible for dealing with. In addition, any product, any exhibits that come from any of these inquiries, they will be responsible for putting before forensic responders, forensic service providers for fingerprint, DNA, hairs, fibres, whatever the trace work may be.
So here, in this example, going to scenes in response to the investigations, we heard yesterday from MK26. Were you able to hear MK26's evidence?
I was, sir.
So in terms of the division there, would the officers and the forensic team be responsible for responding to the CBRN event, but also submitting exhibits to DSTL?
That is correct, sir. They would do the recovery and the submission.
Next, please, then, the digital investigation team. For what was that team responsible?
So the digital investigations team are responsible for examination of any media that is recovered. So that might be a phone, a laptop, it may be a sat-nav, it may be a camera, or it may be a CCTV system. But ultimately they're responsible for the recovery, the imaging, and then the forensic examination of those items. They will then produce that for the investigations team and for the media viewing team.
And in this case, where we know there was contamination of such materials, you said that they'd normally be responsible for the forensic examination. How did that work in terms of division of responsibilities with DSTL?
So as part of the development of the capability, I had a team of forensic and digital responders that were trained to either go into a CBRN environment and do recovery, or to work with MK26's team in the laboratory to exploit the material which was contaminated. So they were able to work in a contaminated environment and do the same role.
Thank you. And broadly speaking, what was the nature of the priority digital items in the 2018 investigations?
So broadly speaking, for this and most other inquiries, it will be the recovery of anything that might give us an indication, or the senior investigating officer, an indication of what the individuals had been doing, where they may have been, what they might be looking to do in the future, who their associates were. So for this, given that we had two people that we were unable to talk to, the digital media would have been one of the key elements for us to be able to identify where they'd been and what they'd been doing. So it was phones and laptops, iPads, etc.
And were you, when you say two people unable to speak to, in both cases, in fact, that was the case at the Skripals and Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley, is that?
That is correct, sir, yes.
And the third team, then the media viewing team, what was their role?
So they were a team that were more recently created. By that I mean a good number of years before 2018, but we found ourselves being deluged with material from phones. As technology improved, the volume of material got far greater, and it was taking a lot of time of the investigators to view the product. So we created a team based on what the London office had done, which were able to view all of the product that had come off the phones or the computers, working to a strategy that was developed in conjunction with the senior investigating officer. So they would look at all the phone data, all the computer data, videos, emails, telephone calls, etc., text messages, absolutely everything, photographs, video clips.
And in this case, did they need to go to DSTL to work in that environment, or was the material downloaded and conveyed to different?
No, the material would have been downloaded by the digital team and then via hard drives be made available to the media viewing team, sir. There was one slight anomaly with this particular inquiry in relation to the tasking of the media viewing team. Did you want me to cover that now?
You can.
Please, thank you. So in relation to this particular inquiry, because of the volume of work created by the scenes and the laboratories and the complexity of what we were dealing with from a forensic and digital point of view, compared to the volume of CCTV material that was being recovered, the decision was made that my media viewing team would focus on CCTV and work to another chief inspector to take that responsibility away from me to allow me to focus on the other two areas with my forensic manager.
Thank you. Then in terms of your own role, which you deal with at paragraph 21 of your witness statement, what were your primary responsibilities?
So my primary responsibility was to work in conjunction with the senior investigating officer my responsibility was to prepare on their behalf for their sign-off a forensic strategy. So in other words, the way in which we would respond to these incidents. And in relation to the day-to-day running, I would be responsible for identifying and prioritising the scenes that we were working in, and also the priority and submission of any exhibits which had to be examined as well. And whilst I would take a lead on this, ultimately I would pass that information to the senior investigating officer, who may or may not agree with what I said and change it. Invariably, that wasn't the case.
So we've heard the senior investigating officer for Operation Wadana was VN 012,
That is correct, sir.
and Operation Reed DCI Philip Murphy.
Yes, sir.
And we've heard from Commander Murphy his role in assisting with those investigations. Did you liaise? How frequently did you liaise with those three people?
I would say almost daily, sir. Almost daily, invariably. So there would be a meeting every morning, and in the early stages every evening, and they would be the main meeting that I would look to attend.
And you've indicated that your responsibility was prioritisation of scenes in particular. Presumably that would involve as well making sure resources and equipment were available?
Yes, sir, it would. It would basically be to make sure that if we identified scenes, that I would then set a task which may be developed with MK26 and also the senior investigating officer to make sure that they were in a position to deliver that task or mission whenever it was tasked to them.
And so in your liaison with the senior investigating officers, you'd brief, would you, the key forensic and activities and findings?
That is correct, sir. Yes, I would.
And were you also responsible for safe operating practices within the forensic environments?
Certainly I was, yes.
How did that work as between roles for you and DSTL?
Okay, sir. So when these inquiries come in, they're big and they're fast and they grow arms and legs. And when I say that, I mean in relation to the scenes, the complexity and the speed in which it's running. So on that basis, I have a global library, I refer to it, with all of my forensic strategies in and all of my risk assessments in. They are all template stroke generic strategies. Excuse me. So when I have a CBRN search to do, I can go straight to a template which I've developed in quieter times and use that as a template. That template would have been sent to my forward forensic coordinator down in Salisbury for them to share with the staff down there, and over a number of days or weeks that would be enhanced to being a bespoke strategy for this particular inquiry.
So would that include safety considerations?
That would include all safety considerations. In addition, on a daily basis for each specific task, the team leader from my side and the team leader from Porton Down would look at what was asked of them. They would write an action plan and a risk assessment which would be signed off by a senior scientific advisor at Porton Down before they were allowed to do that particular entry. And if it was a really unusual entry or something a bit different, they would do a dress rehearsal before they actually went across the threshold into that environment.
And were those procedures in place before March 2018 in Salisbury, that arrangement?
So, to be perfectly honest, it's one of those that we exercise together and we will cover some of those issues, but it's not until, for want of better words, the heat of battle that they become really refined and they're developed from that perspective. So I can't remember, but certainly my templates and during other exercises or operations we would have rehearsed that, yes.
So that covers the teams going into CBRN environments. To what extent did safety considerations for the broader public impact
So if I can take that one step at a time, please. So in general terms, this all gets back to, for me, the cordons and where the cordons are placed. And with any cordon, there is a significant amount of disruption to residents or other people. So it would be finding that fine balance between keeping the public safe and keeping the integrity of my crime scenes. And that was sort of foremost in my mind. If I can look at it from a selfish point of view, if I can keep it tight, there are less people that are going to be upset, and therefore less pressure on my team, my senior officers, me, to try and deal with that scene and return things to normal. That would never stop me doing anything, but it is a consideration. And if I can give one example, so with Christie Miller Road, in the initial stages, my forensic coordinator wanted to evacuate all the properties in Christie Miller Road so that we could operate in there and keep our scenes forensically safe and the integrity preserved. I then asked him to go back and look at it as if a family member lived in each and every one of those properties and how he'd feel about having his family evacuated and whether there was a workaround that we could do to try and work with the residents, keep them safe, but also at the same time allow us to do what we needed to do properly. And as a result of that, rather than evacuate every house, we stopped one family using their driveway. There came a time when we needed to revisit our cordons. When we revisited them, it was because of when we identified, for want of better words, ground zero, it meant our practices weren't as safe for our staff as we'd hoped them to be. So we had to rejig our footprint, and we got to a stage where we were going to stop 3 families using their driveway, identified one family, required vehicular access due to disability, and we worked around it further again. So from an overall point of view, working with the cordons and public safety is paramount in my mind, but we've got a job to do, so we have to do that. From the point of view of the wider public, I attended meetings with the SIO and Public Health England where we agreed to share our product with them so that they could do the wider public health piece.
So you sharing forensic findings or status of investigation with PHE through the SIO, was that?
So it's an agreement with the SIO that we would share the results from DSTL with Public Health England so that they could do their work. In addition to that, I was also at the meeting when we agreed to share all the visa receipts from the Mill and Zizi with them so that they could do work to try and identify people that might have been in there to safeguard those as well.
Can I just ask practically, how did that happen? Did the material go direct from you to the SIO or direct to the PHE or in another way?
Okay, so I am aware it wasn't easy, and if I can explain, we are 60 miles from Porton Down, where I operate from. So what we arranged was for Public Health England to be able to collect their own data directly, with a caveat that it would only be used for what they needed it for and no other purpose.
Thank you. Could I ask you now, which you indicate paragraph 23, page 5, that you had access to subject matter experts. Which were those for the purposes of searching in your forensic investigation?
Okay, so first and foremost, internally, I had access to my own tactical advisor that was able to advise both the senior investigating officer and myself, and a CBRN tactical advisor will give advice or options for the way in which we should operate, and they have an enhanced knowledge around CBRN incidents. So I had somebody that was able, in fact I had 2 people that were able to do that for me. I also had access to a police search advisor, also known as a pulsar, which was VN 939, and a representative from the National Crime Agency to advise on search. And that wasn't just for me, that was for the senior investigating officers as well.
So I think VN 939, a Wiltshire officer, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And what's the difference in the role of the National Crime Agency search advisor as opposed to the Pulsar?
So, sitting above both of the, or three of the senior investigating officers was another senior officer whose responsibility it was to have like a helicopter view, and that individual advised speaking to the National Crime Agency to an expert to see whether or not they could add anything else to what we were looking to do. So they were invited to the planning meeting around search.
Thank you. You mentioned the senior officer. Is that the PIP 4, Detective Superintendent Kath Barnes?
Yes, I wasn't sure whether or not she was ciphered or not. That's exactly who it was, yes.
Thank you. We've heard from Commander Murphy that she had oversight of all of the 3 investigations with Dana,
Yes.
Caterva and Reed.
Yes, it was, yes.
Moving now then, and you've touched upon this, but to your working relationships with other bodies, which you deal with at paragraph 25, with which external organisations did you liaise closely during the course of the investigations?
So both during the investigation, but also as a result of relationships in my role as the CT-CBRN forensic lead, through established contacts, I dealt with the Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism within the Home Office. I dealt with the Ministry of Defence through the military side that were assisting. I dealt with the National CBRN Centre, who were responsible for assistance with personal protective equipment, PPE, and also for arranging ambulance support, heart support to our scenes. I worked with AWE, the Atomic Weapons Establishment, in the early stages just to establish that it wasn't a radiological incident that we were dealing with. And then throughout the inquiry, a number of other organisations I would have dealt with as well. The main one being DSTL Porton Down, which was a daily.
And I was going to ask you, you've mentioned daily liaison and also liaising specifically with MK26. Did you liaise with others, or was MK26 your primary point of contact?
No, I had absolute access to any of the senior scientific advisors that are required through the operations centre that they were running. My normal day-to-day contact, and for the sake of consistency, would have been with MK26.
And aside from your direct communications with MK26 and others at DSTL, how were communications between your team and DSTL facilitated?
So in the very early stages, they were facilitated by phone or video conferencing. Very quickly, we established the benefit in one of our police officers going to Porton Down and one of the DSTL Porton Down staff coming to my office. So we had one of MK26's staff in my office and vice versa. So we were able to expedite things as quickly as we needed to.
Thank you.
And also, they also gave advice at the same time, which was beneficial. Sorry.
No, thank you very much. No, it's very helpful, and we'll come to the specifics. Could I just go to your witness statement, paragraph 26, it's INQ 006140, page 6. Yes, and just to help you and to assist us in dealing with this perhaps more briefly, you set out there that in the course of this investigation I also worked with a wide range of other organisations, and the principal ones are set out and we've heard about these. Firstly, Wiltshire Police, the local police force. From your perspective, was it that when you'd completed your forensic examinations of a particular scene to obtain evidence, you'd hand over to Wiltshire Police to coordinate decontamination or reopening of the scene, any consequence management?
Yes, sir. In the very early stage, it was there was a line drawn around what was the police investigation and consequence management which is a separate area altogether, which I'm sure you'll come to. But in general terms, as soon as we finished with the scene, it went to Wiltshire Police. But my other involvement with Wiltshire Police was through a counter-terrorism liaison officer. We put in a bid for resources to help with the hazardous area response teams from ambulance and also for search capability, and that was done through the tactical coordination group lead at the same time. So we used them for that, and on a daily basis we briefed into that individual what we were going to be doing and what we required from them.
We've heard the tactical coordination group sat within the SCG, beneath perhaps the
So-
local arrangement. Sorry, could we pause 1 minute? So I've had a request to stop the feed. Thank you, sir. Mr. Asman, I was asking about the tactical coordination group and for your confirmation that that sat below or within the SCG, the Strategic Coordination Group, which we've heard was the local group managing the local consequence management.
Yes, sir. My own understanding was that they were the group responsible for making things happen as identified by the Strategic Coordination Group.
Thank you. And moving on there, Public Health England, we've discussed, apart from what you've already covered in your evidence, would you attend the SCG yourself?
No, sir. I attended one, which was the initial meeting in relation to the Charlie and Rowley and Dawn Sturgess inquiry. Apart from that, I attended none. If I can expand on that, sir, there were so many meetings that I had to focus on what I had to do.
You needn't think that you have to explain every detail. We absolutely understand how overwhelming this must have been, and that work had to be allocated.
Thanks, sir.
And no need to go through the detail, but just to see there other bodies that you refer to: Wiltshire County Council, the local authority, Department for Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs, dealing with decontamination and remediation of scenes, Salisbury District Hospital, where the victims were treated. You've referred to the Hazardous Area Response Team, and you say there as well, providing medical cover for your officers and staff entering CBRN environments.
That is true, sir, yes.
And then the United Kingdom Intelligence Community provided input to the investigations generally via the SIO or PIP4.
That is correct, sir, yes.
And then the OPCW, about which we heard evidence yesterday, were invited to visit, to make independent visits.
That is true, sir, yes.
Thank you. So you've indicated that there were very many meetings going on. You attended one of the SCG meetings, but how did you otherwise keep up to date with what the SCG locally were doing and vice versa?
We in counter-terrorism policing were either represented by the PIP4, Kath Barnes, or by one of three other officers who attended the meeting and took to the meeting what we required, but also brought away from the meeting anything that we needed to know about. So they were a two-way conduit for keeping us up to speed and for us to be able to share what we were doing.
And what about the STAC, SAGE and HERC, those other meetings that we've heard about, the Science Technology Advisory Cell within the SCG, SAGE meetings, the national meetings, and HERC, the national local bridge? Did you attend those, or did you, again, send anyone from the forensic teams?
No, we had a representative. I personally attended none of the three. I had a representative at the STAC meeting, which was the Scientific Advisory Cell. That was beneficial because if we had questions that were slightly outside the norm that we would ask a senior scientific advisor at DSTL Port Down, I, through my representative there, could ask those questions. Yeah. An example being for advice around the animals and also in relation to the post-mortem in particular.
So that's the STAC. What about SAGE or HERC? Did you have representatives?
So the without looking at my statement, I apologise. I can't remember what they stand for.
Sorry.
But the Health Emergency Response, I think it was one of them, was a latter meeting which was bespoke to this inquiry for the first time. We were invited to send a representative. My focus was on the scenes, and that wasn't an option. And SAGE is the government one, which we don't get involved in anyway.
So would you expect your information, if you didn't have a representative at those meetings, to come from the SIO?
That is entirely the case, or the PIP4.
Thank you. We have heard some evidence from Deputy Chief Constable Mills and Professor Dame Sally Davis about there being concerns within the police about a lack of connection between national and local public health advice, which was what led to the establishment of HERC. What was your experience in terms of the availability of accurate, up-to-date public health advice to you as head of the forensics team?
So I was aware of the information which was circulated to us by the PIP4 that was being issued by Public Health England for general residents of Salisbury. I personally did not think that was enough for my staff that were actually, I drew a difference between people in Salisbury in general going around their business that may come into contact with the nerve agent, and my staff who were physically handling objects that were contaminated. And I did ask for some additional information that was not available. However, all my staff that were in the scenes knew what the signs and symptoms of nerve agent would have been through their normal training.
Your staff all being CBRN trained, is that correct?
All of my staff entering the scene were volunteers and well, fitness-wise, and they were all CBRN trained with the proper equipment. Their training would have included the signs and symptoms for nerve agent, which we were tested on pretty much every course we did.
So was your concern, as you're in your role, for the safety, obviously, of your staff, did your role involve any consideration of the advice that was being given to the public, or was that for other bodies?
That was most certainly for other bodies. That definitely, as I said, gets back to that policy I made in the early stages around consequence management and what was within my gift to resolve and what wasn't.
So in summary, you're looking for evidential matters and are concerned with the safety of your staff in that process?
That is absolutely correct. I think where I described Wiltshire Police, I said that was consequence management. I was there for the investigation and for the SIO.
Thank you. I'd like to move then to asking you about working in the CBRN environment. We've heard from Commander Murphy on Tuesday this week that working in that environment was slower than for a usual counter-terrorism or murder investigation, not least because of the safety considerations. In your witness statement, and it's at paragraphs 30 to 42, you give details about that. So can I ask you to share, insofar as you're able to in this forum, about the challenges? First of all, may be obvious, but what were the risks to officers searching?
So the risks to the officers searching, if they weren't wearing their PPE properly or there was a breach of their PPE, could have been death, I think is a fair way of saying it, or them becoming extremely unwell, which is why we had the hazardous area response teams from the ambulance service close at hand with a rescue recovery process for our staff operating in the scene.
So I was going to ask you about the extra measures needed. You've mentioned PPE and also the training of individuals. What effects did the PPE have on how long things took? And broadly speaking, why, by reference to your witness statement, if you need to, which is paragraph 30.
Sorry, paragraph?
30.
Bear with me 1 moment, sir.
Well, I think Mr. Murphy told us, and it probably wasn't a great surprise to us, that operating in bulky PPE is necessarily slower and more complicated than without it.
Yes, sir.
Is that basically it?
That is exactly it. It affects dexterity and it also affects your peripheral vision, and everything needs to be done, if possible, at a distance.
Thank you.
So even you indicate in your statement, routine tasks such as opening doors or taking photographs takes much longer.
It does, and consideration has to be given to when you open a door, how you open the door, whether or not we leave it open so that we don't have to touch it again when we do another entry. So that pretty much everything that we do has to be considered within that environment. And the other thing I do allude to here is the temperature.
That's what.
And we worked through extremes of weather. So officers became sick through hypothermia when they left the premises, having been in a hot environment with PPE. They came out going through safe undressing in an area where it was snowing, albeit we had tents over us. So we had officers with hypothermia, and during the second inquiry, I had officers that went down with extreme heat exhaustion because of operating in PPE. We operate in a scene for a safe time that was dictated to us by the science from DSTL Porton Down, whether it was in the cold or in the heat that came later on. But because of the PPE, you cannot wear anything else. You can't wear something that brings the temperature down. It is what it is.
And we've heard that it was extremely cold, Storm Emma, the cold snow in March, and then
Yes.
you've alluded to it, heat in July.
Yes, extreme heat, which really restricted the amount of time that we could be in the premises.
And how did the CBRN risks affect the examination of, for example, digital media then? Is there anything you can tell us beyond what you've said about having to
Yeah,
submit it?
so you know, from my own experience of Live and Enco, I was able to implement a policy whereby with the digital media, what needed to be examined in contaminated scenes, we were able to do with extended cables and literally work outside, having connected up things however we needed to do. So it didn't stop us doing anything, it was just slightly more complicated. And that was recovered had to be examined in the laboratory under those conditions.
Thank you. Mr. Eisman, Ms. Whitehall, I do not need and should not have fine detail of techniques of examination.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
So what impact did initially not knowing what the agent was and then subsequently finding out that it was Novichok have broadly on your forensic investigation?
So in the initial stages, we didn't know what we were dealing with, so we were taking caution. Very quickly, we identified that it was a nerve agent, and then subsequently for me, through the announcement by the Prime Minister, I identified that it was Novichok. A number of days later, the difference between it being nerve agent and Novichok made absolutely no difference to me whatsoever, or my staff.
And I'm looking now at paragraphs 34 to 35 of your witness statement. You describe additional provisions needed to be made in order to avoid contamination by an officer. Broadly speaking, is that making sure you have medical assistance at the scene and having specific undressing procedures?
That is correct, sir, yes.
We've talked about the role of DSTL and your team, but specifically within when you're talking about going into the CBRN scenes, and you deal with this at paragraph 39, what was the division of responsibilities between the SRT, which you say is the DSTL specialist response team, and your officers when entering the scenes?
So I think first and foremost it has to be recognised that they are scientists and come with additional knowledge. So from that point of view, they would be responsible for advising around what could and couldn't be done safely, or how things may be sampled, or how things may be swabbed within the scene. My staff and I were responsible for identifying what should be recovered and how forensically it should be recovered. Subsequently, when things were submitted to the laboratory, Porton Down were responsible for all of the analysis.
And did DSTL take the samples at the scene, or did your team, or both?
So we seized physical exhibits, sir, and the swabs were done by DSTL Porton Down. We then subsequently did the submission, having recovered the exhibits outside of the premises.
Moving to prioritisation of scenes, was that your responsibility?
Ultimately, it was the senior investigating officer's responsibility. However, like everybody had lots of things going on. So if I was able to assist or give a steer, I would. And during the daily meeting that I've mentioned, I would suggest what our priorities might be if the senior investigating officer was happy with that course of action. And invariably they were.
And you indicate in your witness statement the prioritisation was based on value to the investigations or a specific exhibit's ability to mitigate any ongoing threat or assist with clinical treatment. Were those the primary considerations?
They most certainly were, sir. And the weight on them would have been depending on, you know, first and foremost, it would have been around if there was something there that might have assisted with clinical mitigation and then the investigation. So public safety first and then the investigation.
I'm going to move on now to Operation Madana and the immediate response to the Skripal attack. Now, we've heard about this from Commander Murphy and from MK26. So from your perspective, we're looking at the forensic point of view. In your witness statement, you say by way of introduction to the immediate response, and it's paragraph 44, that this period was comparable to the responses to the 7/7 bombings and 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center. What did you mean by that?
So for both of those incidents and for this incident, I didn't get home for a significant period of time because of the hours I was working and the requirement to be available within the office. And the same happened on 7/7 and also 9/11. I think on the first day, I worked from something like 8 a.m. till midnight, got to travel to where I was staying, had a couple of hours sleep before I was disturbed.
So how and when did you first become involved in the Skripal response?
So I was actually at home working on a policy paper for CBRN Forensics, a guidance document for the Home Office, and I received a phone call to say there may be an incident in Salisbury involving CBRN.
So was this on the 5th of March?
That was on the 5th of March, yes, in the morning. I then travelled to my office where I started to get briefings on what happened in Salisbury and what Wiltshire Police were dealing with.
So who had told you what was happening?
When I arrived, I was made aware, or before I left, my forensic manager rang me and said that the incident was running. When I arrived, my initial brief was from my forensic manager, and then I spoke to the Deputy Senior Investigating Officer and the Senior Investigating Officer, and almost straight away into one of the meetings.
And I think DCS Barnes as well at that initial briefing, is that
She
correct?
was indeed in that briefing, yes.
So if we could go to your witness statement, INQ 006140, paragraph 45, page 11. And do we see there where it says on arrival I received a briefing, and the individuals you've mentioned I was briefed, and we see the information you received there, a suspected poisoning of 2 Russian individuals, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, father and daughter. What were you told, if anything, about the potential nature of the poison when you first found out about the incident?
I don't think, I'm just going to read the statement, I don't think initially I was told what the poisoning was. I think it was an unknown quantity at that particular stage, and it wasn't until later on that it became apparent.
So the information that you received is set out there. If we can go further down in the paragraph, it says you were advised that in the early hours of the following morning, the 5th of March, DS Nick Bailey and 2 other officers, including VNO5, had entered Christie Miller Road, and then further down, this entry was subsequently identified as spreading the agent around the address, which significantly delayed us in identifying the location where Novichok was initially deposited, which was often referred to in the investigation as ground zero. However, in policing terms, I respect and understand the rationale for their entry into the house, given the possibility of crucial evidence such as a suicide note or even further casualties.
That is correct, sir, yes.
It may be obvious, but why did the initial search by Wiltshire Police significantly delay you, in your words, in identifying ground zero?
I think I can say now, although we didn't know it at the time, that because they'd entered using the front door, which was clearly identified to be ground zero, and they had handled a number of items in the property, they had spread the Novichok around the property, which meant by the time we went into the property, we were touching things which they'd already contaminated and potentially spreading that contamination even further. And although we focused our activity in areas where we'd hoped they would not have touched, we were still picking up contamination.
So when you first became involved, and I'm looking now at paragraph 46 of your statement, what was your approach or your first recommendations?
So based on what I'd learned from Alexander Litvinenko, my advice to the senior investigating officer, and this would have been before Commander Murphy arrived from London, was that we should seek to try and identify the point where they were contaminated, and the way we would do that would be to identify a contaminated area preceded by a number of locations where it was clean, so we would know that that was potentially where the attack had taken place.
So is that what we've heard Commander Murphy refer to as the clean, dirty line?
That is correct, yes, sir.
So in addition to doing that, what were the initial areas of inquiry that you wanted to pursue? As part of doing that, I should say.
So the initial thing for me would be to identify where they were, where they'd been, to make sure that there were cordons on those scenes and that they were secured. And to the best of my knowledge, that meant we were looking at the Maltings, ZZ's, the Mill Public House. There was the bench in the Maltings. There was a article that had been seen to be discarded by someone who had subsequently become unwell. They were my priorities, to identify resources, make sure they had the resources and the equipment they needed to forward deploy them to Salisbury, and make sure that the areas we were interested in had been secured.
So in your statement, you indicate that initial areas of inquiry were to preserve and obtain clothing, obtain medical samples of blood and urine of those affected, and the medical and clinical history for Yulia and Sergei Skripal, and for samples to be taken to DSTL for examination. I was also concerned to obtain a sample of vomit that I understood had been seized from the scene, to recover a suspected ampule vape that a person who had subsequently reported falling unwell had picked up and placed into a bin in the Maltings, and to swab sample the bench in the Maltings of Salisbury. I also wanted to examine the Skripal's BMW car and home address and digital devices, including mobile phones. So does that summarise the particular multiple but priority inquiries?
It certainly did, and if I can add, I had a meeting the previous year with DSTL around where we should focus our activity in the event we were dealing with something we didn't know what it was, and it was on advice from MK26, the other DSTL representative you heard from already, and Public Health, that we should look for medical records, clothing, blood, urine, and that material. So that's where that advice came from, which is why I focused on that, and then subsequently the preservation of our scenes.
Just to clarify, you referred to a meeting the previous year. So was that advice in general terms the previous year, or was it now specific to this inquiry?
So it was general advice in relation to my role as a CT, CBR and forensic lead, so I could share that advice. What should we as forensic heads focus on in the event of a suspected CBRN incident? And I took that advice from them and applied it to this particular scenario.
You refer to your recommendations, your initial recommendations, being especially based on your work on the Litvinenko investigation. Was it at that time that you felt that experience was helpful, and in what way at the start of the investigation?
I suppose for a couple of reasons, really. We haven't experienced this in the UK, and it's almost one of those where I don't know if I'm fortunate or unfortunate enough to have been involved in all of these investigations, but it does give you a good grounding for going forward, and I was able to draw on that experience for this inquiry. So I was aware of some of the things that had been done and that we'd done in relation to Litvinenko, and I was able to carry that memory and that learning forward to this inquiry.
Thank you. And you refer, amongst those items that you were interested in, to a vape at the scene. You refer to it as a suspected ampule. If we could go to the photograph just to remind ourselves, it's INQ 005677, page 4. Is that the picture at the bottom?
It is indeed, sir, yes.
And I'm interested in the language you used to refer to it, a suspected ampule, even at the outset on the 5th of March. Were you, as a forensic investigator, looking for a vessel like that could have contained a poison?
Not necessarily. I think this was just a member of the member of the public had reported feeling unwell, and the reason they felt unwell is because they'd put something in the bin, and that's why we focused on this specific item. It wasn't until we had a rough idea what we were dealing with that we knew what we should maybe be focusing on. But subsequently, I had a meeting and discussion with DSTL about what the vessel or item that may have done this might look like. This was purely in response to the member of the public becoming unwell.
Thank you.
What is it? You've described it as a vape. Is that what it is?
So I don't know personally, as I don't vape, but one of my...
Don't tell us what... Don't guess, please, Mr. Asman.
No, sir, one of my staff who is the user said it was part of a vape.
Right. Thank you.
Then, with reference to paragraph 47 and 48 of your witness statement, if you need to refer to it on page 13, can you just take us through the actions that you took on the 5th of March?
Yes, so the initial thing was to try and get as much information as I could around what was going on, and also to alert other agencies to the fact that we might need to work with them from an operational point of view. So my forensic manager, I asked to speak to DSTL Porton Down to say that we may need to work with them and then put the steps in motion to secure that capability. And we were also liaising with Public Health England, and we had officers at Salisbury District Hospital to try and find out as much as we could before we started to deal with the scenes.
So I think this was in the afternoon of the 5th of March.
That was correct, yes.
And early evening, was there a further briefing?
Yes, this is the one that I referred to earlier. This was the first operational briefing for the team by the Senior Investigation Officer, VN12 012. And during the course of this meeting, it was repeated what they'd been doing, their movements as best that they could have been identified in relation to ZZ and the Mill Public House, and there was also the question of whether or not those locations had been or should be secured, and the decision was made by the Senior Investigating Officer that those two locations should be evacuated and witnesses at the scene spoken to. It was easier at the mill because there was CCTV that showed their movements, but at ZZ's, the waitresses were spoken to and information obtained from them, which was helpful to us in the way that we moved on with the inquiry.
So that decision to close the mill and ZZ's, did you have input into that from a forensic point of view?
So certainly from my point of view, from a forensic point of view and them being scenes, I advised the SIO it would be beneficial to us if we could secure them.
And what was the first scene that you decided to enter and to take what actions? Paragraph 49.
So the first scene that we actually entered was the maltings with the intention of recovering the ampule or the vape or the vessel that was recovered from there. That was a full PPE entry by one of my teams that went in there and did that particular recovery from within the bin at the maltings. And also a sample of vomit was recovered from that particular scene as well for submission to DSTL Porton Down.
At that stage, you didn't know what you were dealing with in terms of the agent, is that correct?
At that stage, we had no idea at all what we were dealing with, no.
But PPE precautions in case.
Absolutely so, yes.
And then we've heard that the bench and the ampule, as you indicate in your statement, tested negative.
That is correct. The bench and the ampule were negative.
And indeed the vomit as well. Although you referred to DSTL and we heard from MK26 about some uncertainty with that. Were you aware of that at the time?
So I was aware of the fact that it was negative, and I think the term that was used for the whole agent. And I queried that at the time, and to the best of my memory, I recall that as being, in layman's terms, from me as a police or an ex-police officer, it could be that the product had broken down to some of its original precursor materials, but it was not there as Novichok.
So looking at paragraphs 51 and 52 now, what was the state of affairs from a forensic point of view by the end of the night of the Monday, the 5th of March, so the day after the poisoning?
So for us, the day after the poisoning, the first day that we become involved, we were now looking at the maltings as a scene, and we'd also identified the ZZs and the mill were two separate other scenes. We'd identified where they were sat within the mill public house, and through the waitresses we'd identified where they had been in ZZs, although that scene had changed between them eating there the day before and it coming to us. And the rationale behind that was the day they went there and ate, they were exceptionally busy. So the table that would normally contain the crockery and the cutlery for laying out tables was cleared and used as a table for dinings in the restaurant. And that is the table they sat at.
But by that stage, and I'm looking at paragraph 51, was the information that you understood was ZZ's was unlikely to be the source?
So the information that we got was that they had eaten and drank different things, and therefore it's unlikely one particular item of food or drink was the source of the contamination.
So you say you finished this is paragraph 52, you finished your tour of duty by midnight, and by that stage there were at least 10 potentially CBRN contaminated crime scenes which were secured, requiring prioritisation, search strategies and examination. They were Sergei and Yulia Skripal themselves, the home address, the bench, ZZ's, the mill, the car, Salisbury ambulance station and a number of police vehicles and ambulances.
That is correct, sir. And this gets back to that thing, scenes grow very, very quickly.
So that takes us up to the end of that point in the timeline. I wonder if it might be a convenient moment for a break.
Yes, of course, Ms. Whitelaw. Just let me make a note. Sir Asman, we'll break, please, until 5:30. You're in the middle of giving your evidence, so keep your own counsel in the meantime, please, and be back for 5:30. 11:30, please.
All rise.
Yes.
Thank you. So we come now to Tuesday, the 6th of March, which you address at paragraph 53 of your witness statement.
Yes.
What did you find out about the nature of the poison and when and how on the 6th of March?
Yes, so around about 4 a.m. I received a phone call to ask me to go to a phone where I could take a call from MK26, and I then took a phone call from MK26, and in that initial phone call I was told that we were probably dealing with a pesticide, insecticide or nerve agent, and that it had probably been administered through the skin, orally or through inhalation. That information I passed briefly to the Senior Investigating Officer, VN12, and then just before the morning meeting that we were due to have for the whole team, I had a further phone call from MK26 that told me we were dealing with a more unusual nerve agent, but just nerve agent, not any particular type.
So when did you actually find out that the nerve agent was Novichok?
So on the 12th of March, the Prime Minister announced in the House of Commons that the scribbles had probably been poisoned by a nerve agent, Novichok. Up until then, I was just told it was nerve agent.
Though you weren't told the name of the nerve agent prior to that, if you could look at paragraph 53 of your witness statement, about halfway down. I don't want you to give me any detail beyond what you say in your witness statement, but can you just explain broadly what information you were given about it? So we're halfway down paragraph 53.
Yes, okay. So I was basically told it was an unusual nerve agent, and I was given advice around potential delivery methods, which I've already described, and what the outcome may well be in relation to the nerve agent, and we had discussions in relation how it may be detected, and to make sure that the PPE we had been wearing, so the night previously into the maltings, to make sure that that was still the correct PPE. And then we had a discussion for the first time ever around baseline blood testing, which is something I'd never heard of before until this particular event. And then arrangements were put in place for my staff to be baseline blood tested and subsequently blood tested.
So we've heard about that, and it essentially does it mean that so that when your staff go into the scene and they come out, you know whether or not they've been contaminated?
That is correct, sir, yes.
So given the information you did have early on about the nerve agent that you've just explained, are you able to say whether it would have made any difference to your forensic investigations if you'd been told it was Novichok as opposed to a nerve agent and given that information?
I can quite categorically say it would have made no difference whatsoever, and to this day it remains the same.
You indicate in your witness statement, paragraph 54, that at some point on the 6th of March you became aware that Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey had become unwell with similar symptoms. What was the impact of that information on the investigation from your point of view?
So I was made aware of the fact that Nick Bailey had become unwell, and I also established that he'd been to a couple of occasions where that may happen, and whilst him becoming unwell was relevant to the inquiry, it was not, in my opinion, a crime scene, in so much as his home address, his vehicle, and himself. So I actually said it's not something that we should be dealing with, it's something that Wiltshire Police should be dealing with. It was a consequence of what had actually happened, not as part of the direct criminal investigation.
So those scenes of potential secondary or tertiary contamination passed to Wiltshire Police, is that right?
That is absolutely correct, sir.
You'd entered the maltings. We've heard prior to the information about the poison being a nerve agent. What were the next scenes to be entered for forensic examination or searching?
So the first scenes we actually entered were the ZZ restaurant and the Mill public house, sir.
And that was part of the trying to work back and establish the clean, dirty line, is that right?
That is absolutely correct, yes, to see whether or not there was any trace of the agent in those two locations.
You'd done the bench, you said, the day before.
We'd done the bench the day before, so
Okay.
And we've heard evidence that contamination was found at ZZ's in the Mill, but not at levels that would indicate they were the source. Was that the information you had at the time?
I'm not so sure whether or not it was at levels they or I thought. It was at very low levels. Although it was present, it wasn't indicative of it being the point of the attack as I understood it at that time in either of those locations.
So given, maybe obvious to you, but given that you were reaching this conclusion that that wasn't ground zero, ZZ's or the Mill at that time, why was the scene still retained at that point? Scenes.
Okay, so in relation to both scenes, I personally, and I take responsibility for it, was not sure whether or not this was a state act or an act of crime, and on the basis that potentially it may have been a state act, wanted to retain the scenes in case inquiries subsequently revealed that they were attacked by a state party and that they were subject of surveillance at that time, which would mean I may need to visit other tables for swabbing for Novichok, but more importantly to the investigation for traditional forensics, DNA and fingerprints. So I was looking if there was a surveillance team on them to try and identify that surveillance team.
And I'll come back to traditional forensics a bit later on. You say in your witness statement, paragraph 56, that you were informed about the grave of Sergei Skripal's son. Again, we've heard about this in the London Road Cemetery in Salisbury, where new flowers and a plastic dog had been identified that may be relevant to our investigation. This was another scene that required consideration, but at this point, based on the information I had, was not my priority. Could you just explain that for us?
Yes, certainly. So at this particular stage, as we've already identified, I was dealing with the two of them, their house, their car, the restaurants, the maltings, the pub. And although this was another scene, it wasn't necessarily one that was in my plan to try and work back to a clean area to try and find the first clean scene. We hadn't done everywhere else at this stage in the route that we believe they'd taken to do that piece of work, so it wasn't the priority for me at that stage.
And then we moved to Wednesday, the 7th of March, and as you say, you're working to a strategy of identifying a clean, dirty line. The focus shifted then, according to your statement, towards 47 Christie Miller Road and the vehicle. Why did you want to enter 47 Christie Miller Road at that point? What were your priorities and processes from a forensic perspective?
Again, they would have been the same thing from the point of view of we've identified that they are contaminated, the restaurant, the pub were contaminated, working back in the natural course of events, they'd arrived by car, which is why the car was a focus, and then they'd come from their house to get in the car. So they were the next two scenes that we would want to examine for traces of the Novichok or the nerve agent.
We've heard the SIO's initial hypotheses at this time, and you refer to them in your statement at paragraph 58 as being that the Skripals could have been subject to food poisoning or inadvertent poisoning or joint suicide or victims of a criminal act or victims of a state-sponsored act. So was investigating the house part of trying to establish which of those might be more likely?
Absolutely, sir, yes.
And what type of items in particular, and you deal with this at paragraph 59, did you want to examine in the house?
So I've already alluded to this earlier, sir, in relation to the digital media, which might give an indication of where they'd been, what they were doing, what their intentions were, or any other information. And in addition to that, they're personal items. So it would be one thing for me to identify the property, but then in addition to that, if I could take it back to one or the other of them, it might give an indication as to which one had been contaminated first. So I looked at their personal property as well as the actual property itself, as well as the house itself, their personal effects. So makeup bag and personal belongings of Sturgess.
And if you could just have a look at paragraph 59, in particular, just as an example of the sort of investigation thoughts that you were having, could you just tell us at that point, what do you suggest there in terms of items related to Julia Skripal and your thought processes?
So my personal view at that time was whether or not Julia had wittingly or unwittingly been party to what happened, and therefore was there anything in the bins that may have been wrappings for a present that she may have given to her father that might have caused it to happen. And likewise, that is why, one of the reasons why I wanted to search her personal effects in case there were any traces in her bag to say she'd brought something over with her.
So is this part of keeping an open mind and looking at all the possible hypotheses?
Absolutely, totally unsighted and purely speculative work at that stage.
If we could look now, please, at INQ 005238. Could you explain to us just what this document is?
Okay, so this is a forensic strategy, and if I go back to my earlier comments regarding when one of these incidents breaks, we're extremely busy, these would also be in our generic template library, and we would have prepared a forensic strategy for the investigation. In high-level terms, it's a document that manages the expectations of the senior investigating officer and of the forensic practitioners that are going forward to do a job.
So we see there the date in the top right-hand corner, 16th of April 2018. Is that when it was prepared, or were there earlier versions of this?
So there would have been generic versions, and there would have been generic versions available beforehand, and all of the staff were trained in relation to their role and what they would be doing, and each entry was a bespoke mission with a particular task at hand. So to a certain extent, this document would have been written reflecting what we had been doing and what we were doing. It was more bespoke to the investigation than the generic one we'd used. In other respects, it was almost superfluous because there had been bespoke missions that the staff were doing.
And they were recorded in other documents, were they?
They were recorded in the tasking sheets and the admin worksheets of the operators.
I think in this overarching strategy, is there an error you wanted to correct in the first paragraph in terms of the forensic coordinator?
Yes, so I think this document was written by my manager, and he had showed himself as the forensic coordinator, whereas he was my deputy at the time, and it was actually myself, so it should say 513 or Keith Asman.
I think you thought that was an error arising from the templates that you've described.
Yes, I do, sir.
Yes, you told us earlier on, Mr. Ashman, that you had, as it were, a library of
Yes, sir.
templates. So I'm guessing, but is this, as it were, the kind of thing that to which your original templates might have contributed?
Absolutely, sir. This document would have been just another document in the library as a generic template. Things like Operation Madonna, the date, the forensic coordinator, the senior investigating officer would be added, the background would be bespoke, and the intentions of the team would be
Well, if we can
more
go down a
bespoke.
bit in the document, you'll be able to just address that. So we see the background there describes very briefly the summary of events, and then you just referred to the intention. Is that a generic strategy, not referring to specific scenes in this document?
So this would be part of, so by now this was becoming more of a bespoke strategy for this investigation, drawn up by my manager.
And we see page 1 going over to page 2, we've got objectives, investigative forensic, and if we go on to page 2, ensure public officer safety in the investigation of the crime scenes, identify suspects and establish motivation for the potential attack. For later conventional forensic examination of any container or packaging to prove or disprove any subject's involvement in its possession and to link subjects. Is that something that was specific to this investigation, or is that more of something that you would expect in
So
generic?
this is now more bespoke to the inquiry, sir, rather than the initial one, which would have been more generic. May have had more subjects in there, some had been deleted and some had been changed.
But even if the document we're looking at is dated 16th of April, by that point, looking for a potential container or packaging.
That is correct, sir, yes.
We go on to recover harmful substances or eventual disposal in an appropriate manner to identify the source of the agent and substances, establish and maintain continuity of exhibits recovered and prioritise relevant laboratory submissions. And it says the primary objective of the safety of officers and the public will take precedence over any other. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir, yes.
And then just if we see overarching forensic considerations and staffing, this makes reference to aspects you've explained, such as safe undressing procedures. And then if we could continue to go down to page 3, just so that we can see the sorts of items that are included in this forensic search strategy: PPE, barrier, clothing, control of search. We keep going down: photography, sketch plan, search admin, product dissemination, digital investigations, phones, property to be seized. Again, cash use is quite a generic to.
That is a generic one, this, that we leave on there.
Risk assessment considerations. And then at the bottom, we see there it says the separate search strategy for the search of 47 Christie Miller Road should also be read. So in addition to this Wadana strategy, there were specific strategies for each major scene, is that right?
That is correct, and they were drawn up in consultation with Porton Down before each entry.
And we've heard about the tasking sheets, which were a further document for specific missions. Does that summarise it?
That is correct, sir, yes.
And you indicate in your witness statement at this time that in parallel to the early stages of scene management, Yulia Skripal's phone, which was found with her at the Maltings, was subject to forensic examination.
That is correct, sir, yes.
So we saw reference at the end of that forensic search strategy to the separate strategy for 47 Christie Miller Road. Looking at paragraphs 64 and 65 of your witness statements, what considerations were there for you on the 7th of March when Christie Miller Road was the next priority scene? And please do refresh your memory from your witness statement if you need to, as I say, on paragraphs 64 and 65.
So my other priorities were to try and get the product from the body-worn video downloaded so that we could identify what may or may not have been touched during the course of their entry. and generally to carry on searching for personal effects that we may be able to swab or have examined at DSTL Porton Down to see if they were contaminated from within 47 Christy Miller Road.
And we heard that previously you'd been made aware of DS Bailey becoming ill. Were you at this stage made aware of PC Ollie Bell exhibiting symptoms?
Yes, I was, sir. I was aware that he presented to hospital.
And were you also told about the circumstances of that and his involvement in the initial?
Yes, I was made aware of the fact he'd loaned his camera and it had been returned to him.
And had you received advice from DSTL and PHE about the possibilities of cross-contamination when looking at this property?
Yes, I had been. I was aware that there may be cross-contamination within the property from both DSTL and Public Health England, yes.
And although Christy Miller Road was the priority scene, 47 in particular, for you at this point, you indicate in your statement that there were other scenes competing, perhaps for other reasons not necessarily evidential. Can you tell us about that? Paragraph 67.
Yes, sir. So in addition to the key scenes that had already been handed, I was made aware there was an ambulance station that may have property from either of the individuals, Yulia or Sergei, or other staff within it, and that property needed checking to see if there was anything present which may assist the investigation.
So can I just ask, was that something for consequence management or as well?
So that was on the cusp of both. So I would say, because we were looking for property that may affect the lines of inquiry, I would say that was an investigative site. And therefore, I was quite happy that it should be done. And because of the implications to the wider public, would need prioritisation over other scenes.
What had happened at the ambulance station in the meantime?
So the ambulance station, sir, had actually been frozen because there was, to a large extent, because there were property bags in there, although there was
that's all I wanted
some
to know.
activity.
So you had to cope with the fact that that had happened?
Yes, sir.
Right.
So just an indication of some of the other areas that you're looking at, as well as the working back
Yes,
strategy.
yes.
Could we then go to INQ 006141? This is the exhibit to your witness statement. And I think this provides, doesn't it, an overview of the forensic activity throughout operations Wadana and Reed. Do you recognise this document?
I do
exhibit?
recognise this document, so yes.
Thank you. If we could go to page 5. Thank you. And do we see there a timeline showing the places searched, and in particular, 47 Christy Miller Road, first searched or examined on Wednesday, the 7th of March? Is that the black box showing?
Yes, sir, it is.
So does it follow that this is a useful collation of material put together afterwards?
Sir, I did this for the inquiry to assist myself and hopefully others to show where we were on any given day. So at black boxes, we were searching that location.
I understand that, but entered, as it were, made up day by day as you go along, or done at the end with information from your
So
records?
this was only recently done, sir, from records.
That's what I was after.
So I think the difficulty maybe you refer sometimes to investigations as inquiry rather than this inquiry into the death of Dawn
Sorry,
Sturgess.
this specific inquiry,
It's
sir,
all right,
sorry.
that makes it
Thank
better
you.
today. It looks like a document that's been created for us, and you tell us that it is.
It is, sir.
Right, thank you.
So we see there Christy Miller Road entered on Wednesday the 7th of March and thereafter on multiple days. And if we go to page 6, can we see there again, we see the house, perhaps there it's evident the most investigated scene, if I can put it that way.
That is correct, sir, yes.
And then over to page 7, entered multiple times up until, I think that's the 11th of May 18, is that correct?
That is correct, sir, yes.
Thank you. We can take that down now. We move then to Thursday, the 8th of March, and looking at paragraph 75 of your witness statement, can you help us with what the two key points in the timeline were on the 8th of March?
So the two priorities, sir, at this stage were Christy Miller Road and the Scripples BMW car, on the basis that CCTV had identified that Yulia and Sergei arrived in Salisbury a couple of days beforehand in the BMW car. So again, it was for the same reason, to see if there was anything in there that may assist the inquiry, and to swab the vehicle to see if it assisted with the clean dirty line as referred to by Commander Murphy.
Now, the vehicle had been recovered from the car park, is that correct?
That is correct. It was actually recovered by 939.
Indeed, and so I'll ask if we can adduce the statements of VN 939 with regard to the recovery of the vehicle there. INQ 004627 is a statement dated the 9th of March 2018, and also INQ 005013, a statement dated the 10th of March 2018, both VN 939 explaining how VN 939 recovered the BMW infill PE on the 5th of March and conducted what that officer refers to as a defensive search, a visual examination of the exterior, which we've heard reference to previously in the inquiry.
So those are both about the recovery of the car?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Thank you. And Mr. Asman, you refer in your statement to there being an external examination of the car that afternoon. And again, we heard from MK26 and Commander Murphy, internal investigations had to be a bit later. Why was that?
I just, from the advice I was given at the time, there were more safety implications involved in searching inside the vehicle in a confined area than there were doing the exterior search of the vehicle, so,
Yeah.
so it had to be done in the right environment.
So that was the first point, one of the first key points was the examination, I think, of the vehicle. This is on the 8th of March. And secondly, was there an entry that evening to Christy Miller Road for swabbing, which subsequently revealed contamination at the address?
That is correct, sir, yes.
Now, can we go to your witness statement, INQ 006140, page 19 and paragraph 77. So here you're given some information about Yulia Skripal, and we've heard evidence about how she woke for a brief period in hospital and was spoken to by a doctor, and here we see the information that was conveyed back to you from DIVN 104. We see there in particular that the suggestion, which we now know not to be right, of course, do you remember being sprayed, blinked yes, and were you sprayed at the restaurant, blinked yes. My question for you is how, if at all, this impacted on your investigations?
So it only very slightly impacted on it. As I've already mentioned, I wasn't sure whether Yulia had wittingly or unwittingly been involved. And at the point, I think, for the final question where she cries, when asked who did it, I did wonder to myself if she was crying because she felt maybe she'd been identified. So it didn't change my initial thought process about whether she may or may not have been involved in it. And apart from that, nothing else at all.
So you were still following the forensics?
Absolutely. It was information to have, but not necessarily going to change my approach to anything.
We can take that down, but this information as well, was it consistent or inconsistent with what you'd found out in terms of forensic about the presence of Novichok at the mill and 47 Christie Miller Road?
I would say was inconsistent on the basis that she said she was sprayed in the restaurant.
Well, you see, she didn't.
No.
If the record that you were given there is right, someone suggested to her, had you been sprayed? She didn't come up with it herself.
That is absolutely correct. So maybe I should rephrase to say the inference being she may have been sprayed in the restaurant,
Yeah.
but that was not what we were seeing through the forensic results, where there was only a low-level
Yeah.
trace in that location, sir.
And we, of course, bear in mind the circumstances that you had been unconscious in hospital.
Absolutely, sir, yes.
This is the so-called sedation hold,
Yes.
isn't it, Miss Whitelaw? Yes, thank you.
It's certainly as it's been relayed by another officer to this officer.
Of course, yes. But anyway, the suggestion that she'd been sprayed in the restaurant didn't fit with your investigations.
No, sir.
Thank you.
That takes us to Friday, the 9th of March. We've heard from Commander Murphy this was the point at which it was identified that Sergei Skripal's car had produced the highest readings so far. You addressed this at paragraph 80. Can you tell us what your understanding was about the car from the forensic point of view on the 9th of March?
Yes, sir. So the car handle, driver's door was showing the highest reading that we'd had at that particular stage. The car keys were contaminated, and we were then planning to look inside of the vehicle, and the vehicle was moved to DSTL, Porton Down, for that process to take place.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the next priority of the SIO at this point?
The next priority at this stage became the Skripal's graves, and that would be Ludmilla and Alexander.
So we've seen the investigations at Christie Miller Road continuing, but in parallel, other investigative leads being followed up.
That is correct, sir, yes.
And you deal with this at paragraph 81 and going on towards 83. How did the car findings impact your thinking in conjunction with MK26 and the SIO in terms of the likely route of contamination?
I'm just confirming what I thought, what I think I actually was saying at the moment. So the car at this stage had the highest readings, but the advice we were getting was they were not conducive with it being, for want of better words, the term now being used, ground zero, where the attack had actually taken place. The wider concerns with it were the bigger public health issues around the fact it was in a car park and there was a meter with a ticket and the meter may have been contaminated.
So we heard about the meter from Commander Murphy, but can I just ask you, could you just have a look at your witness statement at paragraph 81 to refresh your memory about what you were being advised then by MK26 about the possible route of exposure?
Yes, so MK26 had advised that they did not think the Skripals were contaminated in the restaurant, and that was a view shared by VN12 and myself, irrespective of the Blink interview.
And what were the reasons for that? You set them out at paragraph 81.
I believe the readings were not of sufficient high level for that to have been ground zero.
Sorry, the car, are we talking?
The car, sorry, yes.
And also you refer in that part of your statement to the vomit having not demonstrated contamination being also a factor. Was that?
That is absolutely correct.
Which one
sorry.
might expect
yes.
if there were food ingestion contamination.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
With the car, were you also considering the possibility of cross-contamination? And paragraph 83 is what I'm looking at.
Yes, sir, that is the case. It was a consideration, and I remember a request to try and identify what 939 had done when relocating the car, where it had been touched, where it hadn't been touched, and also whether there was any value in examining PPE to see if that was contaminated, and that a lot of the contamination was cross-contamination.
So we see the statements that we've adduced of 939 being dated the 9th and 10th of March. Is that in response to inquiries being made about how the car was recovered?
That is correct, sir, yes.
You touched upon the ticket machine, and as I say, we heard from Commander Murphy how that, or in particular the coin that Sergei Skripal touched to pay for a parking ticket, had caused safety concerns rather than evidential concerns, and therefore consequence management issues. The car keys to the BMW, were they also both evidential and safety concerns?
Yes, they were. So they were contaminated as well. So it was a question of who'd handled them and where they'd been.
I think they'd been to Bourne Hill Police Station, is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
So did you deal with those inquiries, or were they passed to the stack for consequence management?
So there was the inquiries were initially carried out by the investigation team, and then scientific advice was sought in relation to the coins that may or may not have been used and the consequences of that. And that became a consequence management issue from that point on.
Thank you. And you say in your statement at 86 that you also received advice from DSTL that the closure of Bourne Hill Police Station was recommended due to potential contamination there.
That is correct, sir, yes.
You had to close it for a while, did you?
So I think part of it was actually closed. Property was recovered and part of it was closed.
Looking next at paragraph 84 of your witness statement, you indicate that you sought to identify the plane that Yulia had, or you considered trying to identify the plane Yulia had travelled on, and the vehicle she'd travelled back from the airport. We know that's Ross Cassidy's vehicle. By reference to paragraph 84, why was that?
Sorry, can I just clarify why the plane...
Why you
vehicle,
were thinking about the plane and the vehicle, for what investigative purpose?
Based, sir, on my experience from dealing with Alexander Litvinenko.
Yeah. And you told us, I think, that you'd wondered whether she'd either wittingly or unwittingly brought something with her.
That is correct, sir. Yes.
But I think by the time you hadn't got to that inquiry, if it were, by the time the Ross Cassidy's vehicle had been examined and also Yulia's passport, and both were clear of contamination.
That is correct, sir, yes.
So was that all part of still trying to establish the clean, dirty line?
Absolutely.
So we heard from Commander Murphy about the grave sites being swabbed and testing negative for Novichok, and you indicate in your statement that took place on the 10th of March. Is that how you recall?
That's absolutely correct, sir, yes.
And in your statement, I'm looking at paragraph 85 in relation to that. That's the 10th of March. On the same day, I was advised in the SIO's meeting from CCTV inquiries that Sergei and Yulia Skripal had not visited the cemetery after 9 o'clock on Sunday, the 4th of March, with a further CCTV review back to 3 o'clock on Saturday, the 3rd of March, ongoing.
That is correct, sir, yes.
As we move to Monday, the 12th of March, you indicate in your witness statement, paragraph 87, that you were told Sergei Skripal's hands had been swabbed and showed high levels of contamination similar to the car door handle. What were the implications of that as far as your investigation was concerned?
So I discussed the issue with MK26, and MK26 advised that the swabs of the hands provided limited information and could have been as a result of cross-contamination from elsewhere. MK26 also thought that it was possible that these showed the primary source, but they thought it was from somewhere else.
And by reference to paragraph 91, we're now a week after the poisoning. Could you tell us where you were in terms of forensic scenes and exhibits?
Yes, certainly. So at that stage, we were 5 days into the counter-terrorism investigation. There had been 300 exhibits recovered, including swabs. Almost half of the exhibits were contaminated or potentially contaminated by Novichok, and we had 25 CBRN scenes to deal with 5 days into the inquiry, which included the 3 principal victims. We had in a region of 20 vehicles, which were mainly emergency service vehicles, police and ambulance, and each scene presented its own potential risks, so had to be recovered and taken to a safe area.
And
It was massive for us. It really was.
And we know that on the 12th of March was when you discovered, via the Prime Minister's speech to the House, about the material being Novichok. Did that mean anything to you at that time, as opposed to it being a nerve agent?
It meant nothing at all from the point of view of my response.
And once Novichok was publicly identified on that date, are you aware of information being disseminated to your team, the forensic management team, or CTP, about the properties and appearance of Novichok?
So, not specifically, sir. As I've already alluded to, my team would know what the signs and symptoms for Novichok were. And in open, although I have an idea of what it may have been, I probably can't say any more than that at this stage, sir.
Thank you. And would your team also have known about what the treatment would be?
Oh, yes, they most certainly would.
Tuesday the 13th of March then, we've seen earlier evidence, and we'll just bring it up to remind ourselves, Sergei Skripal feeding the ducks and passing bread to a child. It's INQ 005819, page 69. This is paragraph 94 of your witness statement. How did you discover this on the 13th of March, and what were the forensic implications?
So for me personally, it was brought to me, to my attention during the senior investigating officers' briefings that I've already alluded to. For me, it gave an opportunity to try and find another area to identify whether they were clean and dirty at that stage. So
What was that? Was that the railings?
the
we see there?
railings. So using the CCTV, as I have done on many a previous investigation, we were able to target the specific area of the railings where we could see Sergei touching to swab them for nerve agent.
And I think subsequent examination revealed that there wasn't evidence of contamination on the railings.
That is correct, sir, yes.
And we bear in mind the time period. It was not until the 13th of March that you became aware of this, is that right?
That is correct, sir, yes.
Thank you, we can take that down. On Tuesday the 13th of March, then, was the internal entry to the Skripal car achieved?
Yes, sir, it was.
And we've heard evidence from both Commander Murphy and MK26 of that identification of contamination of high levels, particularly on touch points in the car.
That is correct, sir, yes.
Just go to a document we have seen a number of times, INQ 004704. Have you seen this before? It's a Department of Health email about a reasonable worst case scenario. You'll see the date there, the 15th of March 2018.
I had not seen this until within the last fortnight, where I was shown it to be asked if I'd seen it before, and the answer is no, I had not.
Thank you. We'll just go down in the document just so that we can see. As I say, we've seen it a number of times before, so we'll take it quite shortly, given that you haven't seen it prior to this inquiry. You can see there it sets out risk of a secondary incident, and if we go down to the bit that included accidental discovery of discarded source material by humans. So you hadn't seen the document, but were you aware at the time, so around the 15th of March, of attempts by the Department of Health to provide reasonable worst-case scenarios in which discarded nerve agent led to accidental discovery or a secondary incident?
No, sir, not at all.
Thank you, we can take that down. Were you consulted as either as to that or in any other context at the time, that is following March before June, about reasonable worst case scenarios?
No, sir, not to the best of my recollection at all.
And in other, would you expect to be as part of your role in, given you've dealt with a number of other incidents?
So, as I saw the document then, I did think to myself it would have been handy to have known what people were thinking, but I was not party to it.
So have you in other cases been consulted about reasonable worst case scenarios after an incident has occurred?
No, I have not.
Would it impact on the examination of scenes, Mr.
So, sir, it would have made no difference to what we were doing unless there was specific detail there that might indicate that it should. And I haven't studied the document in detail, but it would certainly have influenced our learning and planning for the future.
Okay.
There may have been something in there, so as I say, I've not studied it in detail to say that we may have learned.
Thank you.
We come now to the Friday the 16th of March, and 16th and 17th was the period we've heard at which the ground zero, as it's been called, was identified, and you deal with this at paragraph 100 of your witness statement. What were the forensic findings and implications at this time?
So if I can deal with this in separate parts, so the fact that the readings were as high as they were would have led to us asking the question, do we think this is potentially ground zero? From the point of view of it being a forensic crime scene, I would want to have secured it, to preserve it, and that would either have been by placing tarpaulin over it or removing the door. In actual fact, I did both. I had it tarpaulined until we could arrange to have it safely removed, and then removed it for full forensic examination at another location. The questions were asked around what difference the time scale between the point of the attack and the point of us recovering it, what difference that may have made to the readings, the weather, the rain, the ice that we had at that time, and if anything, it all pointed to it being potentially higher than it was at the time that it was actually identified.
So what was the purpose of removing the door and indeed the door frame?
So so I think the term I would use is best forensics. So for me, looking at the door, we needed to swab different areas of the door for nerve agent. I wanted to look at it for DNA, for fingerprints, and by fingerprints that would mean a number of different fingerprint techniques, some of which would have involved liquid, and that would have been best done in a contained environment rather than allowing the water to run off onto the driveway and potentially into the environment. So the recovery of the door was all about best forensic response.
Thank you. Could we just go to a document we've seen this week, INQ 003070. This is the letter, so you'll recall, of Sir Mark Sedwell, which we saw with Commander Murphy in his evidence. And if we go to page 3, this is the 13th of April 2018 letter. page 3 in the top paragraph, it says there, during the 2000s, Russia commenced a programme to test means of delivering chemical warfare agents and to train personnel from special units in the use of these weapons. This programme subsequently included investigation of ways of delivering nerve agents, including by application to door handles. Now, Commander Murphy said in his evidence that wasn't known to the investigation. Mr. Asman, were you was the suggestion ever made to you during the course of the investigation that Russia had adopted a method of applying poison or nerve agent to door handles?
So absolutely not. And as I say, it even refers to Novichok in here, and I'd never heard the word before the 12th of March when it was in the House of Commons.
Thank you. We can take that down now. You touched upon DNA and fingerprints. Did you manage to obtain any fingerprints or DNA from the door?
We did, sir, yes.
And you deal with this at paragraph 121.
Sorry, which?
Both, sir.
Right.
So we swabbed for DNA, and we also, through the treatments we did, identified a fingerprint, and that fingerprint was identified to somebody that had visited the Scripples that has subsequently been eliminated from the inquiry.
Was that a handyman?
It was indeed, sir.
So were there any findings of significance in terms of DNA or fingerprints to the investigation?
No, sir, there was not.
In terms of the level of contamination on the door handle, you say in your witness statement there was also a risk that contamination at this level could permeate gloves worn as part of PPE. Are you able to say, and please don't if you don't know or you can't say, whether it was determined conclusively one way or the other?
Sorry, could you just repeat the
Yes,
last
of
bit?
course. So you're referring in your witness statement to the risk of contamination at the level found on the door handle permeating gloves worn as PPE. And only say if you can or if you know, whether it was determined conclusively one way or another, whether that could be the case.
I can't say whether it was determined conclusively, but it did have an impact on us changing our gloves at regular intervals.
So you catered to the risk, as it were.
We were advised that we
Yes.
should change gloves, sir, and we did.
Now, you indicate in your statement, paragraph 110, that you submitted to DSTL PPE worn by the 3 Wiltshire police officers who entered Christie Miller Road on the 5th of March. First of all, was there some delay in doing that?
Can I just refresh my memory?
Yes, please do. Paragraph 110.
So there was a delay, sir, in so much as it was stored at the police station, which may have been contaminated, along with a number of other items of property which were subsequently recovered by another team on our behalf. So it was not available until such time as the middle of March, late March.
I think the 22nd of March, you say.
22nd of March, yes.
And I think we heard from MK26, similar to same as what you say in your witness statement, in terms of the results. And what were you aware of in terms of the results of the contamination? Which items were contaminated?
So 7 of the 8 gloves recovered were contaminated. 2 of the 3 face masks were contaminated, and all 3 sets of goggles were contaminated. And my only other observation was, although there were 8 gloves, I would have expected as best practice to have seen 12, in so much as each officer would have been wearing 2 pairs of gloves. This is indicative of the fact 1 wore 2 pairs and 2 wore 1 pair. And I suppose I should qualify by saying, assuming that they packaged all their PPE.
What was the next priority once the door handle had been established or thought to be the site of contamination, original contamination?
So I think the next priority would have been the wider area immediately in the vicinity of 47 Christie Miller Road.
Thank you. Just before we come to that then, you indicated at paragraph 104 that on the 19th of March, the CCTV team began to conduct a boxing in exercise. And in effect, what that meant was they'd identified CCTV cameras in diverse locations in the vicinity of 47 Christie Miller Road. And the intention was to evidence all persons of interest within a specific time parameter entering and leaving the area. Are you able to confirm whether, as well as public CCTV, that we've seen the cameras that were in the vicinity of Christie Miller Road, but not outside the house itself, whether private CCTV, the availability of that was investigated?
So to my knowledge, this included private CCTV, bus cameras, vehicle cameras, static CCTV systems, absolutely everything that was available to us. As I say, that part of the inquiry was ran by my counterpart, Detective Chief Inspector, that I shared the office with.
Thank you. So to take stock then, by the end of March, you'd entered the Bench and the Maltings, ZZ's, the Mill, the BMW and Christie Miller Road and recovered the door.
Yes.
And in relation to 47 Christie Miller Road, in your witness statement, you say the swabbing had concluded on the 16th of April, but there was a forensic search strategy on the 15th of April, and we've seen entries until May. Is that because the other work, apart from swabbing, other investigative work was still taking place?
That is correct, sir, yes.
And paragraph 120, could you just have a look at that to remind yourself, what was the work, the additional work that needed to be done at 47 Christie Miller Road?
So the first phase was in relation to identifying what would have been contaminated or not, to try and get a feel for where they'd been and what had happened. Given that there was contamination in that property, we needed to then conduct a full examination of it to see what other evidence was present, and to try and identify the motive for the attack on either documentation or other material that may have been in there. And lastly, to see if there was any surveillance devices which may give an indication as to who may be responsible.
Are you able to say whether you did in fact find any surveillance devices in the house?
No surveillance devices were found in the property at all.
Did the focus then move to open searches?
Yes, it did, sir, at the same time as we were continuing with other searches. So Christie Miller Road was still continuing, but we also started to look at the open area searches, having identified the door handle as being the place where the first attack had taken place.
So why was it that it was only after Ground Zero was established that the open searches, by which I think we mean the open spaces, outside areas, gardens, started to take place?
So if I may use an analogy for this, because I kind of think it summarises where we were with this. We were searching for a needle in a haystack. We didn't know what the needle looked like or where the haystack was, or if it was even in the country. We had absolutely no idea what we were looking for or where it may be. And it was only when we knew about the door handle did it become worthwhile looking in the vicinity of the door handle to see if anybody discarded what they'd actually used.
And at paragraph 125, you set out your thought processes underlying the devising of the open search plan. What were they?
So my initial thoughts were that they could have been disposed of immediately where the attack took place. So from the record photography taken at the scene, when the team initially entered the property, I identified there were flower pots, a hose reel, there was a bush outside the premises. So my initial thoughts were, did they do it and then try and secrete it in those locations? Or did they take it away and had it been discarded of somewhere else or retained by them? And I can expand a little bit more on that if you want. So I think my thought was, did they want to get stopped with something like that, which might identify where they'd been or what they'd done, or did it present a health risk to them? So would they want to dispose of it? Or, knowing full well if we recovered anything, we may look at it for traditional forensics, were they better off taking it away? And there was no indication whatsoever to say that they should either discard it or take it away.
And at this point, just to be clear, as well as looking for the vessel that had put the poison there, did you consider the risk of there being more Novichok in either the same or another vessel?
Certainly the same vessel. I have to be honest, I hadn't considered at that time there being a separate vessel, but certainly my concern was that there was more of the same in the same vessel, and that's what I was concerned to try and recover, as was the senior investigating officers.
And did you think about the possibility of perhaps a member of the public or children in particular picking up an item at that point? Was that something in your mind?
Yes, I did, which was the reason why we had the meeting to discuss searching the wider area. So the initial thing was around the door and the hedge and the planter, as I've said, but then I had a meeting with the SIO and with MK26 in relation to searching further afield and how far we should take that.
Can we just go to the witness statement, INQ 006140, page 30, paragraph 126. And that paragraph there, this is, I think, what you've just conveyed. An analogy used at the time was that this investigation was like looking for a needle in a haystack, although in this case we didn't know where the haystack was and we didn't know what the needle looked like. In fact, this was not quite accurate. The reality was that we did not even know whether there was a needle at all. With all of the competing demands, whilst we could work on conjecture, we needed to be directed by the evidence or properly provenanced intelligence that was available. So we can take that down, thank you. Who was involved in planning or strategising the wider search?
So the initial meeting was between the Police Search Advisor 939, VN12 and MK26, and myself at the very least, and potentially could have involved others, but I can't remember personally whether they were there or not.
If you could look at paragraph 134, I don't know if this is the meeting you're referring to on the 29th of March.
So if I can clarify, I'm looking at paragraph 128, where we had an initial meeting and discussed it, and then we moved to the 29th of March for the wider meeting, where Commander Murphy was also present, together with my deputy and a number of other individuals.
Thank you. And at paragraph 36, what was the contribution of the advisor from the NCA to the open search discussions?
Sorry, can I, the paragraph number
Sorry,
again?
136, 3 lines down.
So now you're going to the 29th of March, eh?
Yes, the wider meeting, thank you.
So I think the first thing I would say is the advisor from the National Crime Agency was at pains to identify that their experience was based on crime, not necessarily counter-state threat. So that should be taken into account. And their advice was that whilst there may be public perception of being concerned by seeing officers searching, the risk of not doing that would mean that somebody may come to harm. And then they then gave 3 examples of how they felt or when they felt it may have been discarded.
So really, as you put it in your witness statement, is it looking at things from a criminal mindset perspective, giving you that input?
That is exactly it, yes.
Were you only looking for a potential vessel, or were you looking for other items when thinking about the open searches?
So the senior investigating officer had also asked that we look for personal protective equipment, PPE, that may have been worn by somebody that applied the material to the door handle.
And you alluded to this early on in your evidence, but at paragraph 130, you indicate the thoughts about what sort of item you were looking for. Can you tell us about that?
Most certainly. So I spoke to MK26, and part of that conversation was to try and identify what we might be looking for. We were told it was more likely to be small, man-made, and out of place at that location. There was an assumption that it may carry liquid, and in general terms, if it looked like litter, for want of better words, it probably was litter.
So I was going to ask you who decided these potential features of the container. Was that advice from MK26, or was it in discussion with?
So I think this was a discussion, and this was the outcome of the discussion rather than being attributed to one particular individual.
And you indicate in your witness statement at paragraph 118, we don't need to go back to it, but that you also discussed with MK26 the properties and potential method of deployment of Novichok. So were those sorts of factors also taken into account at this stage?
It was indeed so, yes.
We've heard evidence about there being 3 hypotheses informing the open searches. If we could go to look at those, INQ 005820, that's paragraph 106 there. The search advisor was involved in the investigation from the 4th of March, and this is from the Verbasco police report, when he conducted the initial search of Sergei Skripal's vehicle. Following the identification of the front door as the most likely original point of contamination, 3 hypotheses were provided as to where the suspects may have discarded the Novichok, if they had done so at all. A, in the vicinity of the immediate attack, the door of the house. B, at the points the offenders were out of the line of sight of the house. We'll have a look at just C, thank you. At the points where the offenders could have changed their mode of transport, such as the cross-section between footpaths and roads. Can we take that down? Thank you. How did those hypotheses inform the open search prioritisation?
So they were used in conjunction with another report that we were given at that meeting to inform our planning and the search and the parameters for the search. They were taken from the National Crime Agency advisor, utilised by the police search advisor from Wiltshire, and agreed by the senior investigating officer and myself was responsible for making it happen. They were added to as that work commenced.
Thank you. So I'm going to come on next to the details of the phases of the open search, but I wonder if this would be an appropriate moment to break for lunch.
If it suits you, Ms Whitelaw, certainly. 1:45 then, please.
All rise.
This is before the start of this afternoon's proceedings. Thank you very much.